Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'd like to acknowledge, first of all, that today we meet on the unceded lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and those coming up, especially my First Nations colleagues here at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, who are so generous with their cultural knowledge every single day. We're 1 week away from a very important day, and please let's hope that the outcome of the referendum next week is a step towards a more unified and progressive Australia. My name is Beatrice Grolton. I'm the Senior Curator here at the Whiteley Studio, and I'd really like to welcome you all here this afternoon for Clearwater Reckoning, remembering Robert Adamson. I would especially like to welcome Juno James, Bob's loving partner and extraordinary photographer and activist, and all of the readers, John Dale, Fiona Kelly-McGregor, Gig Ryan, Lisa Gorton and Mark Mordew, who are all here to contribute today. And I thank Juno and Michelle Seminara for coordinating this event. I would also like to acknowledge Wendy Whiteley, who can't be here with us right now, but Wendy was a close friend, is a close friend of Bob's, but also Juno. And she's the reason, really, that we're able to be here today, because as many of you know, it's due to Wendy's generosity and tenacity that the Brett Whiteley Studio exists, and has done so for almost 30 years. In 2025, we turned 30, which is great. Some of you may have noticed that alchemy is not on display at the moment. For the first time in probably 25 years, it hasn't been up. And it's because this current exhibition, Chapters 1959 to 69, draws from the studio's rich holdings of works from a wonderfully experimental period in Whiteley's art when he was aged between 20 and 30 years old. He and Wendy lived during that decade in London for 7 years, New York for 2 years, and travelled extensively throughout Europe before returning home to Sydney via Fiji. You'll see a few works upstairs that haven't been on public display since 1970, alongside others well known in our visual lexicon. So once again, I acknowledge Wendy's generosity in making the studio such a fun and collaborative place to present work and art. Coming up to the studio this summer, we have a major partnership with the Sydney Festival, live music concerts here, the Brett Whiteley Studio sessions, carrying on from our collaboration last summer. So I ask you to keep an eye out for the lineup. It hasn't been announced yet. It'll be in the coming weeks when the festival announce their lineup. It's a great lineup of Australian and international musicians.
Hi, thank you all for being here. Particularly thanks to Michelle Seminara, who's done such a sterling job keeping everyone together, Beatrice, who has helped so much, and I'd like to thank my darling friend Wendy Whiteley, who said to me at some point, oh, we've got to do this again next year, when we launched Bob's Reaching Light. Yes, so I wanted to thank Wendy, really, and that made me reflect on the friendship between all of us. So I just thought I'd give a little background by talking about that, and especially enriched with seeing the Sienna paintings. It's so wonderful to see them all together, and go back to that sort of turbulent period of the 60s when we all really began our friendship and lived really much as a tribe of. And the relationship between Bob and Brett was so beautiful, like two absolute geniuses, really. Self-taught, curious, provocative. And so Bob would come and read to Brett, he would come and read Mallarmé and Rimbaud and introduce him to the world of poetry. And Brett, who was always talking about everything, but in the mix of all that, was really disclosing and revealing how he functioned as a painter and a sculptor. Whenever he came up to us, you know, he was always examining the mangroves. You know, there might be a sculpture here among the trees somewhere. But it was such a beautiful relationship, and when Bob and I got together, one of the lovely things we found was that we had a circle of friends that we already were really engaged with, and now we were together. And not long after we got together, we were walking along Oxford Street, and Brett comes along, just near where I lived in Paddington. And he said, you two. And we said, yeah, we're together now. He said, no, that's impossible. God, you two, who would have thought it? And we thought the same thing at that point. But it was, and then he gave us this big bear hug. And not long after that, we were over here. I was doing a portrait session with him up there. But this was a bit later, and he gave this extraordinary monologue about how he was dry and he was off drugs, and how during the 60s, when we were all young, and we were so free and experimental in our lives, and he was a married man with a child and a career as a painter. And he said, I want my freedom now. I never had it in the 60s. And we were going, alarm bells, you know, what the hell does that mean? But it was a profound and deep friendship. I could go on about it, but I don't want to take up any more time from the readers. So, yes, another sort of conversation that was really important to us, and it comes to mind because of next Saturdays. You know, when we got together, one of those conversations was, do art and politics mix? Do art and poetry mix? I mean, does poetry and politics mix, was the question. And I always had Aboriginal people coming in my house and living there with me, and he got to feel very much, we took each other into different spaces and we discovered things, and out of that came the Canticle for the Bicentennial Dead, which I'm not able to read. But I encourage you to, and for God's sake, vote yes. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Juno. And thank you to Beatrice, Senior Curator here at the gallery, for allowing us to come into this very, very special space today. The last time I was here was in mid-2022, when I was fortunate enough to be asked to help launch Bob's collection, Reaching Light. It was a really wonderful afternoon featuring an in-depth conversation between Robert and his longtime publisher and friend, US-based poetry publisher from Flood Editions, Devon Johnston. And I believe it was also the last public event Robert featured in before becoming ill later that year. Luckily, the Bowerbird Foundation, which was established by Robert and Juno, filmed the event, and I would urge all of you to look it up on YouTube. It's publicly available, and watch it if you haven't already. On that day, Robert was his usual humble self, casually recounting incredible anecdotes of his time with a plethora of literary and artistic luminaries, as well as some wild tales from his youth, of course, and readings and discussions of poems close to his heart, all delivered with his irrepressible and infectious love for poetry. I feel deeply grateful to have known Bob and indebted to him for taking an interest in my work even before I published my first book. I was a nobody, which isn't to say I'm anybody now, but Robert gave you the impression that anyone who loved poetry was somebody worth talking to. And today you will hear from some other people whose lives and work Bob profoundly affected, because his passion was not just for his writing, but for reading and supporting the writing of others, and for fostering an authentically supportive artistic community, which is truly a very rare and precious quality. So, to our first speaker. John Dale is the author of 10 books and editor of 3 anthologies. His best-selling true crime biography, Huckstep, A Dangerous Life, was the winner of a Ned Kelly Award, as was the first of his 3 crime novels, Dark Angel. He was a professor of writing at the University of Technology, Sydney for 10 years, and his latest novel, The Faculty, is a satirical exploration of the modern university workplace. So please welcome John.
I'm going to talk a little about how my encounters with Bob to start with, and then read 2 of my favourite poems that are in this book. My first contact with Bob Adamson was in 1987, when I published a book with Angus and Robinson called The Blank Page. And Bob bailed me up at an Angus and Robinson event and wanted to talk about Stefan Mallarmé and the tension on the page between the blank spaces and the words. He saw a poem being a composite of words and spaces. A few years later, I was editing an anthology of Australian writers about their relationships with cars called Car Lovers. I was looking for writers, and Michael Wilding told me how Bob bought a red sports car with a literature board grant. I was impressed, and I have to say I was envious of the red sports car and the literature board grant. So I asked Bob to submit a story, which he did, Hallstrom's Wall, which is actually an extract from his autobiography, about Bob stealing a car and crashing it into a wall with tragic consequences, and for which Bob was sent to Mount Penang Correction Centre. Paul Keating said that when you change the government, you change the country. And it's also true in a university that when you change the dean of a faculty, you change the culture of that faculty. At UTS, a new dean in the Faculty of Arts was brought in, Theo van Leeuwen, who changed the culture of our faculty. We already had a dynamic writing program staffed by creative practitioners, which was generally regarded as the leading writing program in the country. But we didn't have those longer residencies which they have in the US. I'd been to visit writing programs in Chicago, San Diego and San Francisco, and was impressed by the calibre of writers they brought in, people like Joyce Carol Oates to teach for 6 months. Theo's sister Joke, I think that's how you pronounce it, had been the city poet in Antwerp. And Theo encouraged creative ideas and the idea of bringing in prominent writers, attaching them to our writing program. So we met with the late, great Brian Johns from the Copyright Agency and pitched to him the idea of a chair in Australian poetry, modelled on the chair of poetry at Oxford University. The appointment was to be offered to one of Australia's leading poets. There was only one other professor of poetry at that time at Sydney University, which was more for a teaching academic role. We were successful in our application pardon me, and received a grant of $300,000, the largest ever given from the Copyright Agency for the chair and 2 other residencies. The chair in poetry attracted applications from across the country, and we whittled it down to a short list of 5 major poets. Bob was the unanimous choice. Unfortunately, our shortlist was leaked to the Sydney Morning Herald. Someone complained, and the Dean and I were summoned and reprimanded by the Vice-Chancellor for disclosing confidential information. I don't know where those loose lips came from, but it wasn't us. Some people suspected Bob himself, but only Susan Wyndham might know. Bob settled into UTS very well. He was a great addition to our writing program, popular with students and staff. He was open, gregarious and knowledgeable. We had a number of major writers and residents come through that place at that time, and many of them regarded a residency as a sinecure. But Bob was different. He didn't want to hide away in his office with the door closed doing his own work. He wanted to engage with students and be part of the academic community and pass on his knowledge. He was in constant demand, and it was a great time to be working there. As my friend Gabrielle Carey once remarked, those were the golden years in the UTS writing program, when there was a strong sense of creativity and encouragement by senior management in creative practice. Bob regarded it as important to pass on his knowledge and interest in poets who had gone before him, many of whom were neglected or forgotten. He had a genuine commitment not only to his own work but to the work of other Australian poets. As part of the criteria for the position, Bob was required to deliver 2 public lectures a year, and he spent a lot of time and effort in researching those public lectures. They were very well received and worth checking out online if you haven't yet listened to them. I remember him researching his lecture on Michael Dransfield and Vicky Viticus and telling me all about Vicky Viticus, how he read and reread everything she'd written and how impressed he was with the quality of her prose and her poetry. Here's one of Bob's emails to me I found yesterday. I couldn't come in today, John, because I am deep into my cow lecture, much research and reading Francis Webb's correspondence supplied by his sister. It's going to be a good one. These lectures are a new form to explore and push. The research is done, but now to craft an interesting narrative to keep the attention and add excitement. You can hear Bob's voice in those words. Bob's appointment as chair lasted until the end of 2014, and Bob and I got on extremely well during those years. We spoke regularly, and we had a lot in common with our musical tastes, Van Morrison and Bob Dylan in particular. I remember one morning in May 2012, I was coming into work early on the bus, and the driver was playing at full volume on his own transistor radio, Tangled Up in Blue, Lay Lady Lay, and Hurricane. And I told Bob when I got into work about this mad bus driver, and he said, yes, it's Dylan's birthday today. He's turned 71. Bob enjoyed that bus driver story. David Island was another writer we both liked, and he told me how much Dorothy Hewitt and Patrick White admired Island's work. Bob was the first person I knew who had read the American poet Frederick Seidel, who was accused of writing sinister and disturbing poetry. Bob read widely and had a deep knowledge of contemporary writers and writing. I liked Bob a lot. He was genuine and he had an infectious enthusiasm for writing and for conversation. He listened as much as he talked, which was an added bonus in academia. For someone who had never been to university, let alone worked in one, he fitted in extremely well, passing on his knowledge to a new generation of poets and acknowledging the debt he owed to those older poets who had gone before him. Bob gave back to the students, and he really loved being a professor of poetry. And as he said to me, it gave his reputation and work as a poet a great boost. He was very productive during those years. Unfortunately, the culture of the place changed and we were unable to continue the chair in Australian poetry. It was a shame, but universities like Goldfish have very short-term memories. When I was 8 or 9 years old, I used to be allowed to buy one comic a week. Sometimes I chose a Disney or a Dick Tracy, but my preference was always for the Phantom comic. And whenever I finished reading my Phantom comic, my father, who never read anything, comics or books, would always ask to read it. The last time I spoke to Bob in person was on the 1st of September 2022 at the Glebe Hotel, and I told him how much I loved this poem of his, The Phantom, and how it connected with me. The Phantom. My father was a fisherman who made his own nets. He would use lengths of horsehair for the crab snares. On weekdays, he drove his horse and cart to the fisherman's co-op. Saturdays, he'd hitch up a sulky and take me to Paddy's markets. It seemed he was always working, except when he drank at the Oaks Hotel. He relaxed by reading paperback westerns, unless a new edition of The Phantom had been released. Then he'd lay on the floor and read it right through. We weren't allowed to interrupt. If we did, it meant trouble. Our mother would say, "Leave your father alone. Can't you see he's reading his Phantom?" The years went by, and I wrote many books, none of which he read. Whenever we spoke, it was about cars or fishing. He came to see our new place on the Hawkesbury, walked into my study, the walls stacked with books and paintings, looked about and considered things, his eyes fixed on a print, a pop art version of the Phantom. Then, in a conspiratorial tone, he said, "There he is." It's a great poem, that. I'm going to read one more final poem, The Long Bay Debating Society. I spent my 21st at Long Bay Penitentiary. Each day in the front yards, we paced up and down. At nights, I read novels and the poetry of Percy Shelley. Sometimes an education officer would turn up and ask, "What are you going to do with your future?" I'd tell him I wanted to be a poet. He would shake his head and comment I was being insolent. After weeks, I convinced him we wanted to start a debating team. There were plenty of crims who would join up. It took a month to convince the governor. Finally, the authorities agreed we could form a debating society. Things went well, and we attended library and researched our topics. Then came the day a team from the outside agreed to come inside and conduct a debate with us. However, there was a condition. The governor would choose the topic. Eventually, the prison librarian ceremoniously handed us the governor's note. It was the summer of 1964. Our topic, is the Sydney Opera House really necessary? Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. It's beautiful to hear those stories. Okay, so we're on to our next speaker, Fiona Kelly McGregor. Fiona has published 8 books, most recently the novel Iris, shortlisted for the Miles Franklin Award, the New South Wales Premier's Award, the Australian Literary Society Gold Medal, and longlisted for the Stella Prize. McGregor is also known for a large repertoire of performance art and event curation, and writes for the Saturday Paper, Sydney Review of Books, Sydney Morning Herald, Art Monthly, and more. Please welcome Fiona.
Thank you. I actually didn't know Bob very well, probably the least of anybody here. So I'm really honoured to have been invited by Juno today. I did have some significant connections though with Bob and his work, and I think that I would have come across it when I was a teenager. There was a lot of literary journals in my house because my mother did a poetry program, so I came across Gig's work at that time too. Vicky Viticus, John Forbes. I was really drawn to the urban poets, and Bob especially because he had this great sense of nature attached to the city of Sydney. Anyway, later on we did meet and we did correspond a bit, and we swapped books, sent each other books, and Bob sent me his memoir. So I'm going to read some of his prose today. I would really urge you to get this book. It's just so well written. As a prose writer, I read a lot of poetry, but I can't write it. But most poets, or so many, write great prose when they actually do it. The other thing about the connection we had is that we both grew up on the North Shore, but when Bob was in Neutral Bay, like in the 40s and 50s, it was a much more rustic place. And I'm going to read from the beginning of this memoir, which talks about some of the crazy things that he did, and then which led to things that most of you would know about here, and I'll talk a little bit in between it. This is from a chapter called Birds and Fish. From as far back as I remember, I've been fascinated by animals, compelled to get close to them in whatever way I could, by hunting them, studying them, keeping them in cages, or imitating their behaviour. We lived only a short tram ride from Taronga's Park Zoo, which I loved. I often went there, at first through the front gates with my parents, then later by myself, mostly over the fence near the quarantine area at Athol Bay. My visits to the quarantine area were invariably nocturnal. It was an eerie place. Night after night, I'd climb out my bedroom window after my mother had seen me to bed, then catch the tram down to Athol Bay and jump the fence. I got to know exotic creatures: cassowaries, zebras, lions, giraffes, ostriches, emus and reptiles I'd never seen before, such as salamanders and a Komodo dragon. One night when I was 10 or 11, while climbing over a barbed wire fence, I slipped and fell into one of the enclosures. When I got up, I found myself face to face with a cassowary. It had a deep, resonant, furious-sounding voice that hissed and drummed simultaneously. Booming and strutting, it headed towards me. In my bird book, I'd read about cassowaries disemboweling men in New Guinea when provoked. I felt gutted already as I stood there petrified, utterly still. For the longest 10 minutes of my life, with the great black bird circling around me, its horn of a head fringed with iridescent blue feathers shivering in the moonlight, booming, hissing and gurgling around and around, until finally it walked over to the other end of the cage and completely ignored me. So I love this because it's like what he became so great at doing, writing about birds. And also, I remembered when I was 8 or 9, because I used to play in the bush near the zoo. Me and a friend decided that we were going to break into the zoo. So we went to the wall. It was just an old stone wall. We climbed up the wall. It was really easy. And we were like, there was an enclosure. We were like, great, we'll just drop down into this empty enclosure and we're in the zoo. And then just before we were going to drop down, a rhinoceros walked out from the back of the enclosure. And after the rhinoceros came a zookeeper who just went, hi, and saw us straight away. So I was not so successful as Bob at breaking and entering, and I certainly didn't develop this relationship with birds. Anyway, what's the next bit I was going to read? Where Bob starts to experiment with catching birds. So he used to make cages and traps, and he'd go and hunt birds. He was so fascinated with birds. And he writes, I'd get the rainbow lorikeets home and nurse them until they came to. They always bit my fingers. I sustained a few serious wounds, and some became badly infected. But still, it was contact, and that was what I wanted. I found it exciting. I wanted to will myself into the bird's head, though not exactly to tame it. I think what I was hoping for, as I stared into each bird's eyes, was some flicker of recognition, some sign of connection between us. I wanted the bird to recognise and accept me, but as what? So then it goes on to describe the great rifle bird theft, which had terrible consequences. And I'm talking in an elliptical way because I'm hoping that you could still get this book, or perhaps you know these stories already. So Bob gets really interested in rifle birds, and during his first year in high school, he discovered that Taronga Park Zoo had a rifle bird in a specially designed enclosure tucked away in a part of the zoo, and I'm reading now, that I seldom went to. I knew that if I failed my exams, as I surely would, I'd have next to no chance of ever getting my leaving certificate and becoming an ornithologist, and no chance, therefore, of getting closer than the general public to this incredible birds. They were rare, they weren't like road peckers. I couldn't just go out and get one, unless it dawned on me I stole the one they had at the zoo. It would be like a bank robbery, I thought. It might make national news. Certainly it would make local headlines, so I'd have to cover my tracks. So I'm going to skip now to the event. The rifle bird's cage was more strongly fortified than most at Taronga. It was made from glass to retain the humidity, reinforced with wire mesh. I needed tools, a hammer to smash the glass, and some wire cutters and tin snips to deal with the mesh. I also took a small crowbar. I put the tools in my fishing basket, tied it to my bike, and strapped a fishing rod alongside. This was camouflage. If you were out late at night and the cops asked you what you were doing, fishing was okay. It was a normal, healthy pursuit for a boy. The afternoon before, I'd stashed a cockatoo cage wrapped in hessian in some bushes near the zoo, so I wouldn't have to haul it through the streets at night. If all went according to plan, I'd be leaving the zoo just on dawn and be going home in broad daylight. I arrived at Taronga at about 2 a.m. and I went down the back towards a quarantine area where I knew I could climb the fence. I threw the tools and cage over first, then followed. I knew there was a night watchman who patrolled every 2 hours, so I waited by the cages where the rifle bird was kept until he'd passed by, and then I set to work. I didn't want to traumatise the bird or draw attention to myself by making a lot of noise. So I used the hessian to muffle the hefty whack I'd delivered to the glass with the hammer. When the glass barely registered the assault, it cracked a little and buckled slightly. I panicked. I threw the hessian away and I began hurling blow after blow at the glass. After half an hour or so, I did finally make enough of a hole to get at the mesh, but as soon as I felt the resistance it offered, I knew that my tin snips were useless. Nothing short of bolt cutters would likely have an effect. There was nothing to do but bail out. I went back over the fence and wiped my fingerprints off the tools with my t-shirt. Then I hid them under some bushes. But I hadn't given up. A couple of days later, I returned in daylight to see what they'd done about the cage. It was surrounded by a kind of barrier like the crime scene it was. It was empty. I was devastated, thinking they'd moved the bird to protect it from theft. It was probably in far north Queensland by now. But as I was leaving my access point near the quarantine section, I heard the unmistakable call of Ptiloris magnificus, the harsh rasping notes described by Neville Cayley, coming from one of the sheds. They'd moved it to protect it, not from theft, but from louts and vandals. The quarantine area wasn't well known or readily accessible to the public and was therefore low security. I was thrilled. My plan was back in action. The following night, I made my way back to the zoo with the cockatoo cage. I'd seen where they kept the keys to the quarantine sheds on previous expeditions, though I'd never before had a reason to use them and collected a bunch. I couldn't believe my luck. I found the rifle bird without much trouble in a hospital section in one of the sheds, where it was probably recovering from shock. It was in a special cage designed for easy veterinary access that slid out on a little tray and fitted snugly inside my cockatoo cage. As the sun came up, I was lugging it home. The rifle bird was mine. So this theft leads to, it's a kind of cascade, and it begins, Bob does his first spell, gets into trouble with the police, and he does a spell in a boys' home, and it cascades, and there are more events. And I'm assuming that other people here will talk a little bit about that, but he did spend a lot of time in juvenile detention and prison, and there's a lot of descriptions of that in here. And they're so beautifully brutal and tender both at once. I probably don't have time to read a lot, but there's just this one, he had, some love affairs in there, and so there's a real Genet quality to a lot of this writing. It's 1950s, it's really, really squalid and brutal conditions. I'm just going to read one paragraph to close, which I think is beautiful writing about brutality. The sweet, vicious young thugs who worked in the officers' mess toiled with wax rags and sand stope, their undiscovered bodies sweating under grubby white smocks. They drift over the hardwood floors, dark stringy fringes or limp blonde curls hanging damp in the sweet-smelling atmosphere they brought with them, their faces translucent. They had dirty fingernails, their noses were runny, their front teeth were missing. They had oyster shell smiles and their lips were covered in cold sores. Chilblains ate into their fingers and toes. They fought behind the boilers with fists and arms, with their teeth or with their feet up against hot metal, or with broken glass or forks in their hands, or fence wire staples between their fingers. In private, the terror of sex was upon them. They wiped the cum from their fingers in fear of being found out. Thank you. That's it.
Okay, so our next speaker is the incredible Gig Bryan. So Gig is the winner of the 2012 Grace Levin Prize for Poetry and the 2012 Kenneth Slessor Prize for Poetry. She's the author of New and Selected Poems 2011 and Selected Poems 2012, and she has also written songs with her bands Disband and Driving Past. She was poetry editor of The Age from 1998 to 2016 and is a regular poetry reviewer. Her next book of poems is, and I wish I could steal this line or I'd come up with this line, her next book of poems is Eternally Forthcoming. That's a poet for you. Please welcome Gig.
Yeah, I don't want to be concentrating on the prison stuff too much, but just continuing on. I mean, the only thing that I'm interested in from the early prison poems is how good they are. And I think with poets such as his friend and contemporary and rival, whatever, John Tranter, who died recently, you find this with when you're going through these long selecteds and collecteds that they're good at the beginning. They're good at the beginning and they're good at the end and they're good in the middle. So I'm going to read just two of these sonnets, which was from his third book, Swamp Riddles, in 1974. And they're called Sonnets to be Written from Prison. Oh, to be in the news again, now as fashion runs, everyone would go for prison sonnets. I'd be on my own. I could once more go out with pale skin from my veritable dank cell, the sufferer poking fun at myself in form with a slightly twisted tone. My stance ironic, one out, on the run. Though how can I? I'm not locked up. Imagine a typewriter in solitary. I dream my police unable to surrender. I'm bored with switching roles and playing with my gender. The ironies seem incidental, growing thin. Here's the world, maybe what's left of it, held together by an almost experimental sonnet. Surely there must be some way out of poetry other than Mallarmé's still life with bars and shit can. Then he continues on, imagining he's in court. Yes, Your Honour, I know this is ridiculous, although I'm in the news. I couldn't bring myself to do one of those victimless crimes. I must suffer in more ways than one. My crime's pretence is not to overthrow social order or to protest. It's my plan to bring poetry and law-breaking into serious interplay. Imagine newspapers in solitary. I could walk right through the court, taking down copy. Catch me if you can, defendant in contempt. There has to be a fight. I can't imagine anything if I'm not up against a law. Here's the world, our country's first stone institution, where inmates still abase themselves at night. If I was in solitary, I could dream, a fashionable bore, writing books on drugs, birds, or revolution. And something that is probably not apparent when I'm reading it is the rhyming schemes are actually brilliant in these poems and much stricter than you realise. You know, they're so subtle. So another one I was going to read, or actually I might just... I've written so much on Bob, actually, that I didn't really want to write another essay on him. I sort of feel I've said quite a bit in Sydney Review of Books, Australian Book Review and The Age and whatever. But one thing I find very interesting, he has this constant sort of rubbing against another person, another poet. In fact, I remember him telling me years ago that he would always write, with whatever he was reading at the moment, and what he was reading then was Shelley, and he would have the book propped open on his desk. And I just found that, bizarre, like what a bizarre thing to do. Like, why would you want to be, sucking the blood from someone else? Why would you want that weight, over your head? But he, obviously it worked for him. It was a brilliant inspiration. And I think there's this constant kind of, disguise and revelation, mask and nakedness that he kind of plays on all the time, where often he adapts another persona, like usually men, but not always, like Elizabeth Bishop is one, and he's kind of half writing in their voice, but half kind of having a conversation with them. And I think it's quite interesting in Australian poetry. I mean, now of course the internet, everyone's communicating with everyone day and night, but back in the earlier last century, communications, the international communications were more unusual. And I think Adamson's continuing on from people such as Bruce Beaver, who published Letters to Live Poets in 1969, where he's having conversations with Frank O'Hara and people, and I think Adamson continues on from that. And similarly with Tranter, who has a constant kind of wrestle with Rambo. Adamson's is with Mallarmé, but also with Shelley and lots of other poets. There's always this kind of conflict and argument that sharpens his identity, but also sharpens the understanding of the other, I think. And also, there's a sort of, an arena of conflict, but also an arena of love, I suppose. And there's always this kind of striving towards the sublime, but the sublime as he sees represented in nature and birds and the river and stuff. But I've also realised, reading through all this stuff again, that the sort of sublimity and bliss of nature is actually not really true. In fact, the metaphor that is in his poems all the time, it's actually a mirror. What is in nature is the same, predatory existence that we live through ourselves. The difference is it's unclogged by intellect and reason, but it's more of a mirror. It's more of a mirror than a metaphor, I think. Anyway, that's enough of my ridiculous philosophising. I'll just read this one actually, which was originally kind of dedicated to me, but it was based on a joke, and I think the joke was I'd been telling Adamson about an American poet's visit to Melbourne, and we were out having dinner somewhere while the American poet was having a very passionate flirtation with another person, and he'd mentioned, we were ordering whatever, we were ordering beer, I suppose, and he'd ordered a club sandwich, which at the time I just found hysterically funny. I suppose I didn't know what a club sandwich was, and it just seemed such a, I felt like I was in Get Smart or something. And when I was telling Adamson this, we were just kind of imagining this whole thing, like I think it was at the Hilton in Adelaide when I was telling him about it. And, we were just laughing about the whole thing of, there you are, you're the impoverished poet, usually in some flea-bitten bedsit. And suddenly, the next day you're invited to some festival and you're swanning around the Hilton, eating club sandwiches and ordering triple gins, as I think we were at the time. So I think he wrote this poem after that. And it's called Not a Penny Sonnets. And actually, I'm not sure if he's kind of imitating my voice or if he's, speaking to me or was just inspired by that. Anyway. 1. A book launch, plates of water biscuits. There's always the club sandwich, you said, but the corporate types didn't get it. They were busy being freaks, so we spliced letters into words as verbal tattoos, using anything we'd written, digging our biros in. A girl drives by in a low-slung Tirana. Remember the suburbs, those days of ordinary defeat, using street directories so out of date. Sorry. I knew I should have had a triple gin, I think. Using street directories so out of date, they didn't have new streets. We had dreams of driving racing cars. Now, that was something I had in common with Adamson and Tranter, an obsession with cars, even though I actually drive a quite boring car, but I fantasise about Rambler Americanas, and, whatever's bizarre and expensive. We had dreams of driving racing cars. These days we can afford to trade quips at the Intercontinental, go to funerals, throw out old affections, drinking beer and double gins. I'm talking, but nothing seems to grip. Actually, I might just read the third bit because my voice is going. We scoff at good luck from the Intercontinental, flash Medicare cards before signing anything. Our biros dig in to Gone with the Wind, breathing air-conditioned memories in separate skins. Goose pimples, anti-fashion enemies and friends. Back on the street, we take in the city. A Tirana spins its wheels. Skeins of brown smoke clog the pavement. She's gone. But we're still standing here, talking, destroying words. The club sandwich? Well, fiddle-dee-dee. We believe nothing. The shredded trust, the corporate types, just limping figures in dressed skin. The life we mocked surrounds us, distracted, but the tide keeps coming in. I think I'll end here because my voice seems to be going.
Thank you, Gig. Okay, next time we're going to have a triple gin up here for you because we'd love to have heard more. Okay, so next we are on to Lisa Gorton. Lisa lives in Melbourne and writes poetry, fiction and essays. Her awards include the Prime Minister's Literary Award for Fiction, the Victorian Premier's Literary Award for Poetry and the Philip Hodgins Memorial Medal. Gorton also works as a poetry editor. She completed a doctorate at Oxford University on John Donne's poetry and prose and is writing a prosopographical book about his work and times. I had to practice that one. I probably got it wrong, didn't I? Prosopographical.
I'm still practicing it myself.
Okay. Please welcome Lisa.
Thanks very much. It's an honour to be here with you, among you, celebrating Bob Adamson's poetry. He was someone I always looked up to and someone I always read, and he was startlingly kind about my first book, which was partly startling because it didn't really deserve it, but I think that was a tribute, I guess, to his generosity. So thanks for inviting me and organising it. Lately, I've realised that sometimes when I'm reading Bob Adamson's poetry, I connect it in the back of my mind with a scene from his autobiography, Inside Out. It's a scene when he's in hospital after an accident, and he's blaming himself for having caused, in his mind, the kind of damage that can't be fixed or soon forgotten. And some parents come in to see him, and they sit down by the bed, and they forgive him. And I've realised that I have this scene at the back of my mind sometimes when I'm reading Bob's work, because to me it seems to dramatise, in a way, two elements which meet in his poems. Firstly, there's his readiness to face what he calls somewhere the living beast, the hunger and the violence, which finds its place in his work, particularly in his accounts of growing up and alongside and fishing on the Hawkesbury River. Well, the feeding and the hunting and the light on the water there. When I think of Bob, I have that vision of the river. But alongside that sense of the living beast, I think there's also a sense of some freedom outside these violent transactions, something equivalent to that forgiveness that he was given, something unlooked for, unaccountable, disinterested and large. And I think that in his life and in his poetry, he came to see poetry itself as a force which brings that kind of generosity into existence, as one of the forces which brings that kind of generosity into existence. The freedom of poetry and its birds. And I think for me also reading the autobiography, which is a remarkable book, you can get a sense of that freedom. It resonates with his discovery of a book of contemporary Australian poetry in an abandoned prison cell, so that tension between escape and entrapment. But to me, the two elements are not opposed in his poems, but there's this movement of attention back and forth between them, so that it gives his poems a kind of tidal movement, so that when I read them, I almost feel surrounded in that river which is made of the words. And for me, I think it's the sense for him of poetry's vital importance, which gives his poetry that clarity and that feeling for reality that it has. Also, the respect for craft, which had him once win first prize in wedding cake decoration at the Royal Easter Show. Respect for all crafts. But for me, the sense of the clarity of his poems also depends on that kind of radical practicality in his vision. So it's like the poems can seem so thingy because the visions aren't invented by the words. The visions are in the place, and the place is the vision, and it's sort of familiar and existential at the same time. And I think that he keeps in the poetry that kind of radical practicality which we saw in that episode of him stealing the rifle bird from the zoo, a sort of wild vision which is brought down to the practicality of the tools that can be used and how you can do it, a kind of an unawareness of why you would not steal a rifle bird from the zoo and keep it in your back garden. So that's what I wanted to say about his work. I've got a lot of folded corners. I wasn't sure at all, and perhaps I'm still not 100% sure which poems to choose, but I thought I'd read some of the sequence from Growing Up Alone, which is set in his childhood growing up alongside the Hawkesbury, and then Clearwater Reckoning. The backyard to our grandfathers was the Hawkesbury River, and me and Sandy hated it. It meant all the kids at Gosford knew how poor we were, because only fishermen lived there, and we hated it because when you went out on it at night, the dark was frightening and the ground was full of ants. The river with its savage tides that would wear you out in half an hour, and in summer the heat and sun burning into your neck, giving you awful headaches, and nothing to do but fish or hide. 7. I'd been crying under the house. I ran out onto the road, into the same dust and heat again, with the lousy starlings, the dark sheen on their wings, oily, metallic green. I thought about the way we die, the steps just falling away from under me as I ran, the heads of jewfish nailed out along the wharf rail. 207. Some skulls and others still flesh, all with their eyes eaten out. 8. I had this game, it was all different. The paper shop wasn't neat, and the pub didn't smell so rotten. I'd sit in Dad's truck and look out at the town's light, a clear, steady light, nothing like the rivers, softer and shifting, and with people walking through it. 9. Along the shore in the mud, I'd walk all day alone and wonder how come nothing ever happened, how come I didn't go mad or something. Mud caked all over me and my face throbbing with sun and never seeing anyone. 10. We cover our faces with mud and become hunters, in the mangroves, barefoot and nude. Our arms sting from cuts. We talk less until we only make sounds. Sandy gets the first bird, an old wood duck. We share its feathers on the run. Then onto the mud flats, our feet sinking in 4 feet of mud where the big crabs swim. Out here, branches rot away, and we pull each other up out of the mud by our hair. Soon you don't feel things, and you have to get back to the rocks before you realise what you've been doing all day. Coda. Fishing skiff in the light at Mackerel Flats, mud-caked, sunborn by the old man caulking cracks. Rust scales drop from boat slip to silt as he moves. Gnawed, hacked heads of black bream rock through the wash. Skeleton trophies banjo raise, staked out on a pile, their whiptails paralysed chalk. Light seeps through folds in his turkey neck. His eyes don't blink and flick out involuntarily to where mud gudgers pick at the heads. He is alone with his tinkering work. He holds the scraper like a little axe and chips away at the belly of his boat. His finger flesh grown over his fingernails, his hair freckled white, his pupils contracted points. It is morning, and the mangrove air is sweet as I move toward him, my leather shoes cracking oyster grit. I ask, how's the fishing? My alien voice reminding me he is the grandfather of what I am. This is a longer poem called Clearwater Reckoning, a longer later poem. I ride into the long black morning, out here on the edge of the point, far from my wife in Budapest. As the river cuts through a mountain, in Sydney, a poet is launching his new volume, Under Berlin, and I feel like Catullus on Rome's edge. But this passes, and I turn to face the oncoming dawn. The house breathes tidal air as the night fires outside with barking owls, marsupials rustling, the prawn bird beginning its taunting dawn whistle. I burn the electricity and measure hours by the lines. I have strewn words around the living room, taken them out from their sentences, left them unused wherever they fell. They are the bait. I hunch over my desk and start to row. Let the tide flow in. Watch the window with the door locked now. I wait. Hear satin bowerbirds scratching out the seeds from bottle brush. Dawn is a thin slit of illuminated bowerbird blue along mountain lines. In this year of cock and bull celebration, the TV goes on unwatched upstairs. I hear it congratulating us for making Australia what it is. The heater breathes out a steady stream of heated air. I go deeper into my head. I see the Hawkesbury flowing through Budapest. The Hungarians do not seem to mind. They are bemused. The river parts around their spires and domes. I see other cities, whole cultures drawn from territories within. Though with this freedom comes a feeling of strange panic for the real. So I get on with it, writing out from this egg holding my thought in a turbulent knot, a bunched up octopus. I steer away from anything confessional, thinking of Robert Lowell, crafting lines of intelligent blues, his jelly roll of a self-caught mess deep in spiritual distress. Outside, the river pulls me back. Shafts of light disintegrate into clues. Flecked symbols shine with order. The bowerbirds have woven colour around the house. Through bushes, blue patterns of themselves traced about the place. Half the moon can topple a mountain. Anything is possible here, I remind myself, and begin to hum. Flattening out all the words that were impossible to write today, I hum out all the poems I should have written. I hum away now also the desire to write from memory. There is enough sorrow in the present. I look out over the incoming tide. Dark racks of oysters jut from its ink.
Thank you, Lisa. That was absolutely beautiful. Okay, so we come to our lucky last reader. So we have Mark Mordew. Mark is the author of the biography Boy on Fire, The Young Nick Cave, and the poetry collection Darlinghurst Funeral Rites. He is also an award-winning journalist and the founder of Addie Road Writers Festival, which I hope you all get along to because it's a fantastic festival. Mordew's first novel, There's No Telling, is due to appear in early 2024. Please welcome Mark.
I managed to leave my notebook at home, so I'm going to have to improvise, which means you better keep a clock on me and give me a 1 minute warning if I exceed the 15-minute speed limit. It's listening to people speak about Robert, certain things have kind of hovered into my mind. I guess the idea of lifelines and fishing lines and the way all of us have connections. I used to share a house with a gig in Newtown in our mid-20s. Fiona I know from a great band she was in called Upside Down House, back in that period in the 80s as well. So through music and through art. And Lisa, well, we know it the modern way, our pictures on Facebook. So that's the connection there. But what I'm getting to is Robert pulling that past history and us together again, and Robert's influence as a writer and as a human being, pervading us who are all obviously quite different individuals in different ways. I've told this story before. Hopefully it won't bore you too much to tell it again. But it's about when I met Robert, which was when I was at university as a young man, 19 years old. Robert was doing a reading with Dorothy Hewitt, lunchtime. And he was an absolute monster on the day, a real terror, and had obviously been drinking. He got into a complete stoush with the audience, and this is Newcastle, so the Newcastle audience didn't mind serving it back to him either. In fact, they relished it. And it was more like a performance art experience and a bit of a nightmare combined. And I just thought, who is this fucking guy? And in fact, I just hated him, which I just thought, this dude is a horror. Anyway, so it carries on for an hour, and Dorothy Hewitt was obviously loving it. And she reminded me of a kind of medieval witch, and Robert was like this demonic sprite that was doing her evil duty. That was my concept. And the afternoon sort of declined away. Everyone kind of broke up, went to the uni bar. And I don't really know how, but somehow we got involved with Robert, and his temperature had calmed down because we were students. It was afternoon, we were drinking. And we ended up driving together in a car with Robert back to another friend's place who was a musician. And we played Bob Dylan's Blood on the Tracks. We played Jackson Browne's The Pretender, which Robert really loved. A bit of Neil Young, a bit of Bruce Springsteen, all those kind of things. And Robert talked a lot about the lyrics, what they meant, about nature, the city. He seemed to have, like in my very dim memories, a sense of, particularly Neil Young, he compared to Shelley. I remember that, and this whole idea of sort of utopian possibilities or searching within writing. And he was a whole different being, is what I'm getting to. The guy that I hated, that I thought was a horror, was suddenly this really sensitive, soft, friendly and quite boyish figure, who to us was also then already a major writer. He would have been about 33, we were all 19, so he seemed like an old man. And, the time that he gave us, the enthusiasm that he gave us for our own writing ambitions was deep, and it was sincere, and it was also just fun, hanging out. So that was how I met Robert, and I sort of saw two people, this tormented, angry, wild soul, and then this other figure who was very different and very, very open. And I didn't really understand the forces behind that. I think now, today, you've heard a little bit about that. Obviously, Robert had done time in prison. He spent from 12 till about 22, I think, approximately, a decade in boys' homes and jails. He spent his actual 21st birthday in Long Bay. He had got himself into various forms of trouble. The thieving of the magnificent riflebird story that's been covered from Taronga Park Zoo being his major Mission Impossible effort. And it's worth reading inside out just to go even further into how he committed the crime, looked after the bird, and was finally caught. That's that alone. But this whole book, which has been remarked on a few times, is one of the great artist memoirs, not only in Australia, but I think anywhere in the world. The formation of an artist and what has hurt them, how they seek to heal themselves, how they come through their life and begin to change and shift, and the echoes of those experiences, both painful and inspiring that carry on across the rest of a life. I mean, I hate to use the word masterpiece, but it is certainly a great, great book and a very inspiring one for any young artist or writer anywhere in the country. Anyway, so the great riflebird story you've heard about, the thieving from Taronga Zoo. After that, Robert also stole a Gestetner printing thing from a school because he and a friend wanted to do some sort of a community newspaper, which I think featured some sort of headline to the effect of Mr. Smith falls from ladder and is now dead, which was speculation, but it turned out that is exactly what happened. So the whole local street was in an uproar with Robert and all these and his mate. And the thieving of the Gestetner got Robert into trouble again because by then he was on a good behaviour bond. So just silly things that a young, reckless, dreamy kid does. A kid like Robert who's in love with birds, who goes fishing, who's a very sweet boy, who is dyslexic, which is why he was a kind of restless soul. He was smart, but he couldn't settle down at school. He was always getting into trouble. And all these problems compounded and ended up spinning him into this cycle of juvenile delinquency. And the whole thing went from being kind of humorous to something much darker. Robert was raped in jail, bashed. He did a lot of time in solitary. There's a really interesting reflection in Inside Out where he talks about being in solitary and he's in a real blackness and he's putting his hand to the walls, feeling it. And the walls are sandstone, and the sandstone came from the Hawkesbury River. As a boy outside of that jail experience, when he got into trouble at different times, he'd venture to the Hawkesbury and spend time with his grandfather, his Far, as he was called, which was a nickname from Far because he was always far up the river. And so here Robert is as a young man in deep trouble, touching this wall in the darkness, still finding his way to the river through the stone, right? In jail was where he first heard Dylan, the Chimes of Freedom, and that was what stimulated his first songwriting, which became a poems experience. A Jesuit priest visited him and said, "Oh, Robert, these aren't songs, they're poems," which actually disappointed him for a little while. But it introduced him to Gerard Manley Hopkins' poetry as well, which has a lot of allusions to birds and nature as well as spiritual life. And there was an immediate connection there for Robert. And then everything really starts to open up in a literary sense. And he gets out of jail and he's on his way. But there's all this injury from those experiences. You know, he's drinking a lot, he's taking heroin, he hooks up with Brett Whiteley, which I don't know if you'd call that a good influence, but it was a great friendship. And the two of them, you know, bond immediately over Dylan as well as their love of art, literature, drugs and good times. And that whole period sort of is where Robert really starts to flourish. At the same time, he's done a poetry course at Sydney Uni led by David Malouf, where he studies Robert Lowell. So there's this hunger in Robert, this hunger for people, this hunger for art, this hunger for experience. And that energy is very present, you know, throughout all of Robert's poetry, but you see it in a very urban sense and I guess a darker way in all the earlier work. And then it's a little like The Day that I mentioned, where I met a kind of dark Robert and then I met a light Robert. And, you know, it's a bit of a simplification, but I feel that the work goes through a shift, and that shift is obviously meeting Juno and sobering up, getting out of that addictive life, but more than just the addiction, getting out of a performance of being a hell-bound poet, leaving the Rimbaud fantasies behind and deciding to live and getting through the stone of how he had become trapped in the experiences that had traumatised him back to the river in a literal sense, the Hawkesbury River, but back to the river that was in him as a young boy who had a much more pure, loving, ascending vision of life without all those dark experiences ever leaving him, of course. So that's the kind of narrative of Robert I know, and it's also a narrative I really appreciate, because about 8-9 years ago, when my life was taking a darker turn, one of the first new poems I'd written in like a decade, I just wrote something, stuck at Redfern Station and put it up on Facebook, which I've begun to do in a kind of manic basis ever since. And the very first person to respond, the very first, was Robert Adamson, right? He sent me a message letting me know he liked the poem, and I was like, wow, because I hadn't heard from Robert for quite a while. And I just think how many nationally known, internationally known, award-winning writers of that stature reach out to people and just recognise in a wild moment that something good is there and seek to encourage you and look to inspire you. And I think in some, well, it was kind of obvious actually, but who intuit that people are in trouble, but they have value and that they can help and just push things along without sort of being unrealistic or soporific and giving you fake sentimental advice. Like, after that, of course, I'd always look at whatever I put up online and be thinking, oh, maybe Robert will like this one, maybe Robert will like this one. And after about 20, then I get another like. And so I say, okay, right, yeah. So there's actually a quality check going on here. You're not going to love everything, but anyway. And I just think that that openness is critical to why we've all gathered here, and to something about the way Robert writes, in the sense that there are those traumas and those edges from his jail time, from his addiction, and this shift into the river, to back to birds and nature. There's still, despite the need to defend himself and that comment about predatory and mirroring elements that really stay with me, there's still this openness to the world, a deep sensitising sensibility that, I hesitate again to use the word redeem, but to not have become so much like that the stone is porous, right? That the ageing process lets the air in, lets life in, lets the water in. And I think all these things like water currents are running through Robert's work. So that's my loose, spiritual, autobiographical take on Robert. Hopefully I haven't kind of rambled too loosely there, but I'll read a poem. I actually chose all these terribly dark poems from the early phase, but that doesn't make sense now. I've arrived at the lighter part of Robert's life, which has occurred through Juno and through how Robert got to the river, stayed with the river, ensconced himself there and embedded himself with it, heart and soul and elementally. So I'll read the Kingfisher's Soul, which is for Juno, to close. A wave hits the shoreline of broken boulders, explodes, fans into fine spray, a fluid wing, then drops back onto the tide, a spume of arterial blood. Our eyes can be gulled by what the brain takes in. Our spirits take flight each time we catch sight out. Feathers of smoke dissolve in air as we glide towards clarity. In the old days, I used to think art that was purely imagined could fly higher than anything real. Now I feel a small fluttering bird in my own pulse, a connection to sky. Back then, a part of me was only half alive. Your breath blew a thicket of smoke from my eyes and brought that half to life. There's no evidence, nothing tangible, and no philosopher of blood considering possibilities, weighing up feathers or souls. One day, some evidence could spring from shadows as my body did in rejecting the delicious poisons, the lure of dark song. You came with a wind in your gaze, flinging away trouble's screw, laughing at the king of hell's weird command. You created birthdays and the cheekbones of family. I was up, gliding through life, and my fabrications, thought's soft cradle. I scoured memory's tricks from my own memory, in its shots and scorecards, those ambiguous lyrics. Clear birdsong was not human song. Hearing became nets and shadowy vibrations, the purring air full of whispers and lies. I felt blank pages, indentations created by its images, getting by with the shapes I made from crafted habits. You taught me how to weigh the harvest of light. There was a bright innocence in your spelling. I learned to read again through wounded eyes. Wispy spiders of withdrawal sparked with static electricity across skin, tiny veins, a tracery, live coppery wires conducting pain to nerve patterns, all lightweights to your blood's iron. You brought along new light to live in as well as read with. Before you came, whenever I caught a glimpse of my own blood, it seemed a waterfall of bright cells as it bled away. The clouds of euphony created by its loss became holes in thinking, pretend escape hatches. A rush, wings through channels of my coronary arteries. We slept together when you conjured a bed in your Paddington treehouse, barbless hours. Peace appeared and said, soon a future awaits you. I preferred the cover of night, yet here I stepped into the day by following your gaze.
I'd like to just thank you all so much for being here today. Thank you once again to Beatrice for allowing us to come into this special place, which was it's not just a special place, but it was a very special place for Bob. And also thank you to Bob's beloved partner, Juno, and to their Bowerbird Foundation for making this celebration of his life come together today. Thanks also to Angela Stretch, who you will see sitting over here. She's director of a wonderful organisation called Poetry Sydney. She supports a lot of poets throughout the area, and in particular, she is supporting our Poets Today in the role of bookseller. Some of our writers have travelled from interstate, and everyone's gotten out of bed and gotten upright, and that's the main thing. So as much as we would love to thank all our poets, as you know, the best way to thank poets or writers is to buy their books. So if you'd like to do that, you can visit Angela over to my right here at our little bookshop. And if you would like to join us directly after this, we're going to sort of shuffle on down to the Cricketer's Arms in Surrey Hills so we can raise a glass in honour of Bob. Would you like to say anything to conclude, Juno? No? Okay. Thank you so much, everybody.